want to welcome you here to the fifth place on this Easter journey. And this is where we stop and we reflect upon the cross. The question I want you to think about is this, is how do you unbreak something? How do you unbreak something? I remember when my brother and I, when we were younger, we were playing volleyball in the living room while mom was at work and dad was at work, and we were just kind of messing around. And I remember one of us hit the ball a little harder and it glanced off an arm and went into mom's vase. It was one of the vases that she really liked, and I just remember it hit it in the top, knocked it off, and broke it. And we had this great question, how do you unbreak something? And we did what we could. We grabbed the glue, the pieces, we tried to put it all together, and it looked awful because we're like, oh, we are so not gifted at unbreaking things. And so we hit it, and I'm thinking eventually it got tossed. Now, I think that's what happens a lot of times when things get broken. We just decide, you know what, it's not even worth it. Let's just get rid of it. I heard somebody say this recently, and I really like it. You've heard the saying, God doesn't make junk. And I like that. But he added a second part, which was this, that God doesn't junk what he makes. And even though we were broken by sin, the coming of Christ, that this Easter season is really about a great restoration. It's really about a great unbreaking. And so as we think at this time, this is the big idea I want to think around. That through his breaking, we are made whole. We're going to read from Luke chapter 23, beginning at verse 26, and this is what it says. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him, and made him carry it behind Jesus. And a large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. And when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him, and they said, He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was a written notice above him which read, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, Surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness the sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. You know, as we think about this entire scene, as we watch Jesus as he's being led to this crucifixion, he's being crucified along with criminals, that he is found among the guilty. I think it's a striking scene. It's a gripping scene. That Jesus, who is innocent, is still dying with thieves. I remember hearing when Mel Gibson, who directed The Passion of the Christ, was making the film, he was talking about that scene where Jesus is crucified and he's being nailed to the cross. And if you've watched the movie, it's quite graphic, but you'll see that as the soldiers put him down, and then they zoom in tight on his hand as a hand comes in with a spike, and then you see it come down with a hammer. And Mel Gibson said that's actually him, because he wanted to remind himself that the reason Jesus went to the cross and the reason he died wasn't because of someone else, but because of what he himself did. And I think it's really interesting. I think, as we reflect on this, why did Jesus go through all of this? He did it for me. There's a song that says this great line, "It was my sin that held him there." The truth is Jesus took our place. He took what we deserved. The innocent was judged with the guilty. And the reason was so that we could be saved. And this is what Paul would write about this great story, that God made him who had no sin to become sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God. You see, even as the people were taunting him, they were crying out, "He saved others. Let him save himself." And that phrase, "save himself," we find 3 different times. And saving here is so much more than just rescuing or getting off the cross. Saving is about restoration. It wasn't just about Jesus saving himself. Jesus came to save others. And in that saving, not only to rescue, but to restore what had been broken, what had been ruined. And as he's on the cross, there's a thief on both sides. On one side, there's one who mocks him and who's longing, "If you're the Messiah, save yourself and save us." And he's really just saying, "You know what? I want salvation in my way." Yet the other one says, "Jesus, when you come in your kingdom, would you remember me?" He came to Jesus. One mocked, the other expressed trust in Jesus. And I love what Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And the idea of paradise there is the idea of restoration. It's the idea of the recreation of Eden, that which sin devastated and demolished way back in the garden. Because of what Christ was doing on the cross, he was making all things new again. And it tells us that the curtain was torn. And the curtain was the fabric, the barrier that kept people from entering into the very presence of God. And when Jesus died, our sin was atoned for, and a way was made for you and for me to come into the very presence of God. You see, through his breaking, we are made whole. What sin ruined, by Christ's death on the cross, we are made whole. And I encourage you, just even before you leave this place in this moment, to thank him. Thank him for the wholeness and peace that he brings to our lives. He took our place. And maybe you've never made that decision. You know what? We have the opportunity to think about how we're going to respond to this. Will we be like the one criminal on the one side who would mock Jesus and want salvation or redemption on his own terms? Or will we be like the other that says, "Remember me"? You see, simple faith changes everything for us. And I pray that this day, if you have not made that decision for Christ to change you, to offer up a little prayer. Because it's amazing how a simple prayer, "Lord, remember me," can change not just this moment, but all eternity.